Yes.
What are we doing here tonight on a slightly drizzly Chorlton evening?
We're having a talk and a walk down Beech Road as it would have been in 1848, and all the people that you would have had to be polite to.
And these are the people who are being polite to each other whilst we wait. Notice the occasional umbrella. Right,
but I've chosen this spot for a number of reasons, not least of which was that if we'd been here in 1848, in whichever direction you would have looked, you would have had a clear view across field upon field. So if we look north, down towards the what is now the Four Banks, or Kemp's Corner as some people know it, which was then called Markledge, just totally open fields. To the east there, all the way down to Hough End Hall, to the south, across the brook to the Mersey, and of course west. So this was a fairly important part of the township. And where we're actually standing now belonged to one of the people who you might just want to be polite to. There weren't many people in Chorlton that you'd be polite to. We hadn't got a squire, we hadn't got a lord, we got two very big absentee landlords, one Egerton and the other one Lloyd, who between them had bought up something like 86% of the land in the late 18th century. This was the land that belonged to a chap called Holt. His house was literally just a few yards in that direction, and his estate stretched from the corner of Barlamore Road there all the way down to High Lane, then down High Lane as far as Cross Road and back. And that was just his house and his garden. He also owned a stretch of land, literally everything that you can see across there, all the way down to St Werburgh's. And he was only one of the small landowners. But he also was fabulously rich because he'd made his money, his dirty money, out of calico engraving blocks. If we'd been here in 1848, like everywhere else, it would have been fields. Now, there was a farm there, a farmhouse, owned by a chap called Gratrix, although probably by 1848 I think he was on his last legs because he was 71 in 1841. And Gratrix is interesting because, like so many of the farmers, he wasn't strictly a farmer, he was a market gardener. And there's a big distinction because market gardeners are obviously farming smaller amounts of land. In fact, something like nearly 60% of the land holdings rented from Lloyd or Egerton were for sizes of market gardens between 1 and 9 acres. Now, Sutton's Cottage in 1848, the rent was £1 a week. Now, that doesn't mean very much, does it? But the average wage for an agricultural worker was between 11 shillings and 18 shillings. I suppose a rough gauge is £1 for rent, 11 shillings a week, and the repair of a pair of shoes. This bit here is, and I only discovered this about a year ago, was that from the point where that building, the parlour, starts, right the way up to Etchells, was a pond. It's called Blomley's Pond, Blomley's Fish Pond. It stretched all the way that way and stretched far enough back for it to have a bridge. And it's there on the old maps. Those of you who know the Methodist Chapel, which we'll talk about in a moment, the water, to mix the mortar, to build the chapel, the water came from the pond there. And many of you will also remember that lovely house that stood just here, Row House, which is sometimes variously called Lily Cottage as well, set back, demolished a few years ago, great tragedy, dates back to the early 19th century, as does the other one that you can see, well, you can't see much of it now, on the other side. Or it was a lovely building. Again, it's there from certainly the 1840s, because the chap who lived in there, a chap called Daniel Sharp, who I think was a fairly well-off chap. The oldest pub, probably, technically, although it's now not in Chorlton, is the Greyhound, or Jackson's Boat, which is across the Mersey. The bowling green is there from certainly the 1780s, and that building stays there until 1908 when it's demolished. There's a story on the blog this week about that. And then there's the Horse and Jockey. But what there was also were things called beer shops. Now in 1830 the government was so fed up with people drinking gin and the social effects of drinking gin that they passed the Beer Act, which allowed anybody, once they bought a 2 guinea licence, to brew and sell their own beer, which they could do from their own house. And people did, you know, and it was called a jug trade. And in some cases, they literally just did it from their own house. But other times, they set up a proper property. Now, in some cases, a bit like, as I was saying to Tony before, Rob, sorry, with the workhouse, going into the workhouse, opening a shop, opening a beer shop, was seen as a family strategy to get over a difficult time. It's being run by a family called the Nixons, whose father runs the Jackson's Boat. And they're there right up until the 1880s. And if you go past it, just have a look at the sides of the rooms, because it's knocked through now. So if you can imagine one of those rooms, which would have been the beer house, or the dispensing of beer, that was it. There were only 3 rooms in the whole property. So that would then take us on to the